Today, we're digging into one of history's biggest and, frankly, scariest mysteries, the sudden, violent collapse of an entire interconnected world over 3,000 years ago.
But here's the thing, this isn't just some dusty old story. It's a powerful case study, a warning really, about how fragile complex systems can be. And to get what happened, you have to first see a world that was, well, shockingly modern.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're talking about the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. Now, this was not a world of isolated, bickering kingdoms. It was a vibrant, buzzing, interconnected network of empires. You could even call it the first truly globalized economy.
What's just wild here is how deeply dependent these superpowers were on each other. You've got the big players, the Hittites, the mighty Egyptians, the Mycenaeans over in Greece, and they're all tangled up in this incredibly complex web of trade. Egypt needed wood, the Mycenaeans needed metals, and absolutely everyone needed copper and tin, because without those two, you couldn't make bronze. And bronze was everything. It was the engine of their economies and the backbone of their armies. And this kind of deep reliance, it wasn't some historical fluke. It's a pattern you see pop up again and again as civilizations get bigger and more complicated.
I mean, fast forward thousands of years. John Adams is saying pretty much the exact same thing about the American colonies in the Caribbean. He got it. He understood that these networks, they stop being about just getting rich or buying luxuries. They become absolutely essential for survival. And that interdependence, it's your greatest strength, right up until the moment it becomes your most catastrophic weakness. So, what happens when you take that essential network and you put it under extreme stress? Well, for the Late Bronze Age, it wasn't just one problem they had to deal with. It was a perfect storm of crises all hitting at once. There was no single silver bullet here. This was a cascade of failures, one thing knocking over the next. First, a massive, decades-long drought hits the whole region. That means crop failures, which means famine. That famine then lights a fire of internal unrest. Starving people start rising up against their rulers. And just as things are falling apart internally, that's when the pressure starts coming from the outside.
This line from colonial America just nails that feeling of internal pressure, doesn't it? When a system stops working for ordinary people, when it only seems to benefit the top, well, that social contract just shreds. Loyalty vanishes, and the whole thing starts to rot from the inside out. So, with these great empires weakened by drought and rebellion, they were incredibly vulnerable. And into that power vacuum steps this mysterious collection of groups, known to us from Egyptian records simply as the Sea Peoples. Now, when we hear the word barbarian, we get a certain image in our head, right? But as the scholar James C. Scott explains, that term is really political. It just meant people living outside of the state's control. People who weren't on the tax rolls. And in a time of collapse, these were exactly the kind of people, mobile, with very little to lose, who had everything to gain by raiding the crumbling, grain-rich centers of power. So you've got a system that's weak on the inside and getting hammered from the outside. That very interconnectedness that made everyone so prosperous, it was about to become the reason for their doom. And just look at how fast it all fell apart. We're talking about just a couple of generations. The entire system comes crashing down. The Hittite Empire disintegrates. Boom, there goes the tin supply. Chaos erupts in the seas. Bang, the Mycenaean trade routes are gone. The failure of one part of the network sent a shockwave through all the others, triggering a total catastrophic system failure. But the most devastating part of all this wasn't the burning palaces or the dead kings. It was the loss of something much, much more fundamental. As Yuval Noah Harari puts it, the real power of these great empires was their ability to manage information. Writing wasn't just for stories and poems. It was the operating system for their entire society. It ran their bureaucracies, their trade networks, their laws, literally everything. So when the system failed, that entire operating system was just deleted. Complex international trade devolved into localized subsistence farming. Grand monumental cities were abandoned for tiny villages. And, maybe most critically of all, literacy, writing itself, completely vanished from many places for centuries. The world plunged into a so-called dark age, which wasn't defined by a lack of sunlight, but by a lack of writing. So, after all that fire and destruction, what are we supposed to learn from the ashes of the Bronze Age? What's the takeaway here? Well, sure. It's a story of resilience. People did rebuild. New cultures, like the Greeks and Phoenicians, eventually rose from the ruins. But I think more importantly, it's a story about fragility. It shows us that while being connected creates amazing efficiency and wealth, it also transmits shockwaves with absolutely devastating speed.
And this, right here, this is the heart of it. The very thing that makes a global system so strong and prosperous, that intricate network of dependencies, that can also be the very mechanism of its own rapid and total collapse. This whole 3,000-year-old disaster leaves us with a really big, really uncomfortable question. Are our own global supply chains, our financial markets, our digital networks, are they really any less fragile? You know, the scholar Shoshana Zuboff describes our own digital world in terms that are eerily similar. She calls it a Faustian compact, basically a deal with the devil. It's a system that's become so essential to how we live and work that we can't really leave it, even if we suspect that what we're giving up in return might be changing our world in ways we can't even predict. In the end, this is so much more than a history lesson. It's a 3,000-year-old mirror, and it's forcing us to look at ourselves and ask a really hard question about our own future. Just how resilient is the global network that every single one of us depends on today?